everyone, and welcome back to the Gold Hoops and God podcast. I'm your host, Dr. G, and I'm very excited today. I have my amazing friend, colleague, Dr. Grace Vargas. Yay! Dr. Grace Vargas is here with us. She is a professor at TCU. She's also a mom, and she's an incredible historian. Her background is Cuban American. I'm really excited for her to be here today with us, and she's going to share a little bit of her journey and her story, her faith, and all the things that she's learned thus far with us, right? Yay! It's so exciting. Grace, do you want to add in anything as far as introduction?
Nothing really. I mean, just to say I'm so excited to be with you here on this podcast. I wore my gold hoops,
Oh
for
yes,
the theme.
yes,
Yes,
yes. I
so
have like little baby hoops, like
awesome. Awesome.
perfect. I love it. So, little backstory. Grace and I met each other way back when, in another lifetime, during a doctoral program. So, Grace and I were both part of this program called the Hispanic Theological Initiative. It is based at Princeton Seminary on the East Coast. Grace is actually originally from Jersey. That's awesome. And so this program is amazing. Shout out Joanne Rodriguez. She is the guru, an amazing person who has really shepherded so many of us through
Mhm.
the doctoral process, exams, editing, the whole thing. They have an incredible success rate in helping Latinx scholars. So it's focused on scholars of religion, theology, and those kind of topics. It's an amazing group of people. I've made some of my best friends through this program. And so I spent several summers in Princeton, New Jersey, funny enough. So that's how we got to know each other and have kept in touch ever since. So, yay!
Yes. How great that we got to meet in Princeton, of all places, which is gorgeous in the summertime. And it's usually
Yes,
when we kind of connected there.
yes.
And yes, shout out HTI and Joanne and the whole team there.
The
Yeah,
whole crew. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, the whole crew. They're super amazing people. Cool. So let's get started. So on the podcast, I'm focusing on unpacking like Latina identity because so many of us come from different backgrounds, different experiences, right? Rural, urban, growing up in different places and predominantly white cities. And some of us grew up in cities that are very diverse, et cetera, right? And so I would love to kind of hear a little bit of your story and your background as far as like growing up Cuban American. And your family's journey a little bit. That would be fantastic.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yes. First off, I want to just say, like, one of the things that I was so excited to learn about, as you talked about or titled your podcast, Gold Hoops and God, is it connected so much to my actual story of growing up. I grew up in and around Newark, New Jersey. Part of my time I spent in Newark because I went to Catholic school there and also to church there. And then the other part of my time where I actually live was East Orange. So if anyone knows New Jersey, it's kind of that like Essex County, Hudson County area, which there are parts of it that have been kind of fallen within that category of being at risk. So there's a lot of poverty and a lot of crime, and sometimes in some of the areas. So I just remember that being so linked to the my initial story of getting interested in themes of theology, of God, like the idea that was God here, right? It seemed that so many of the stories that I read about God, even in church, etc., kind of describe God coming from these idyllic places like fields of sunflowers, etc. And so, I'm walking the streets and I'm kind of seeing very much the opposite, and also hearing folks, the administrators, etc., kind of speaking about how we were at-risk youth, etc. And it just kind of made me think a lot theologically about what that meant. And I grew up like I'm like what third, fourth generation, like cradle Baptist. I grew up very much steeped in a religious community, and my Baptist identity carries along with it the Latinx identity because my parents became Baptist in Cuba. And so the Baptist community that I was a part of in Newark was Latinx. It was people from all over Latin America, first and
Mm,
second generation folks. So we had all of the issues. We had, immigration issues, the issues of kind of bicultural upbringing among
mhm,
youth, etc. So um, all of that became part of like my discourse on theology. Like, how do we understand God in this place that seems like chaotic, that doesn't seem to
mm,
fit like the typical mold? um, and that very much kind of exemplifies non-linear faith, right? Where people
mhm,
are kind of progressing in one way, strong in their spirituality, and then may have seasons or times in their life in which spirituality may seem something a little more distant. So yeah, you asked also about my family background. So my parents actually migrated to the United States, fleeing the Cuban Revolution,
mm,
and they came in the 1980s with the Mariel boat lift.
right,
And so if anyone knows anything about like Cuban American history, the Marielitos, as they were dubbed, were kind of a unique migration group within the
mm,
United States. And it's funny, I didn't, growing up in that culture, I didn't consider myself a Marielita or child of Marielitos until I got to college, actually, and
interesting.
started
Mm,
learning about the waves of migration of the Cuban
mhm,
American community. And so learning that, the migration that came in the 60s when the
mhm,
Cuban Revolution first triumphed was seen as like the educated class, the white class, the elite class.
right,
And then the
right.
Marielitos had this kind of uh, derogatory kind of a connotation and
Interesting. Mm,
connection. So it was, many people had been imprisoned in Cuba and were also brought within that wave, etc. So there was just a very different reception
mm, mhm,
of the
mhm, mhm,
first from the first wave of Cuban Americans to the second. Both experienced discrimination here in the United States, but all that to say is that my parents never necessarily raised me with some understanding that we were like less than in any way. But at the same time, as I became more and more aware of the history and also how it's being recorded, right? So I'm
right,
a historian, so I'm very
right,
interested in how stories and narratives are constructed and then passed down.
right.
And so then it just became something that was more and more, I would say, prevalent in my understanding of like, how does this community practice its spirituality? What are some of the things that inform its spirituality? So I'd say that
Mhm,
that has been kind of a constant thread
mhm,
in my
mhm.
upbringing.
That's amazing, Grace. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, it's so fascinating to learn about history and the history of different communities and things like that. And it's true, right? The perception of like, oh, this group was like this group was like that, and the reasons, like, oh, the reasons for migration, right, are very varied. And
Yes.
I really love that image that you shared with us in terms of the question of like, this is a very deep theological question. Like, where is God? Is God
Mm-hmm.
here in this place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, that may not have like sunflowers and sparkles and rainbows every day, right? There's some serious things happening, right? I
Yes.
love that. And actually, we'll talk about scripture in a minute. One of my favorite books in scripture is Job because
Right.
Job has the audacity to ask the question, like,
Yes.
what's really going on? Like, what's really happening, right? Is God this truly good and gracious, benevolent God that we're taught about? Um,
Exactly.
it's deep.
Yeah.
It's deep. I really appreciate what you've shared, and
And if
absolutely
I
like this.
could,
Please, please, yeah.
sorry, I just wanted to add one thing. So I don't know if some of my kind of evangelical heads that might be listening might recall. I also grew up kind of not but in the legacy of some of the Billy Graham crusades that occurred in New
Ah,
York, especially
mm-hmm.
me being just about 10 miles outside of New York in New
Sure.
Jersey. And among the crusades, I remember there was the story of Nikki Cruz. I don't know if you if this was
I
part
don't
of your
think I'm familiar. Do
awareness
you
of.
want to
So
give us a
anyway,
little background?
yeah,
Yeah.
just a quick, just Nikki Cruz was kind of this individual that became part of the, as one of the messages in the Billy Graham Crusades, because he was kind of like, someone who was stuck in drug addiction, gang violence, etc., and then gave his life to Christ and had a total like turnaround, right? And his story was powerful, and it was something that was constantly kind of shared with us as a
Mm-hmm.
youth,
Mm-hmm.
in that Baptist community that I was raised in. And at the same time, again, there was some understanding that God can be present only when those previous things are absent, and meaning drug addiction, gang violence,
Oh,
etc.
interesting.
And I'm
Mm-hmm.
not saying that like God is, supportive of gang violence or
Sure.
drug addiction, etc. But at the
Right.
same time, I mean, we can't deny, right? Or we at least have to ask the question, um, you know, can God be present in both spaces? And what does
Yeah.
God's like activity look like in that space? So
Right. 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 Because I totally see what you're saying. Because there can be a sense of like, did God abandon this person?
yeah, exactly.
Right? Like, how can God let them go down such a, dangerous path? Like, what happened? Doesn't God like care? Right? So there's a
Right.
lot of, definitely, it unearths like a lot
Yeah.
of uncomfortable questions about the nature of God and things like that. And that's one of the beautiful things of theology is that
Yeah.
we don't know everything, and anyone who says that they know everything, you
Right.
gotta ask, what's going on.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, I love that idea of like a non-linear faith. Absolutely. Oh my gosh, that's deep. Definitely. Um, I think that's a case for, I think that's the case for a lot of people. The path is not straight. The path is winding. It has its ups and downs. We, all have these obstacles and things that we face on the journey. So I really appreciate that about that you mentioned that it's a non-linear faith.
Yeah.
Amazing. Very cool. I was curious also, so thinking about Cuba and thinking about Cuban practices and religion and things like that, we know that there are other traditions aside from Christianity
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
are practiced in Cuba. So I'd be curious kind of like what your perspective is, or sort of like what your relationship is with some of the other things, like of course like Santeria, all the different practices that are different spiritual practices that happen.
Yeah. So it's interesting with Cuba. I, obviously study Cuba in my work on Protestantism in Latin America. That's been my
Mhm.
first spot of focus.
Mhm.
Um, and I remember coming across, I think it's called the Encyclopedia of Caribbean Religions. And
Mhm.
I remember coming across a statistic that said something like Cuba was virtually a-religious, because there was like no, like people weren't reporting that they were practicing religion. And as
Interesting.
religious scholars were like, no, that's really
That's not
not
true.
what's
Yeah.
happening. But it's interesting though, because I think that has a lot of connection again to the political history in Cuba,
Mhm.
because of the fact that the Cuban Revolution did have immediately some tensions with religious institutions, given that it had declared itself Marxist-Leninist, and therefore also was not necessarily interested in favoring or creating the ripe environment for religion to
Right.
thrive. And then again, that'll be like my opinion on that. I remember my parents growing up telling me, that they in school were trained to, and how we have the Pledge of Allegiance in the United
Uh-huh.
States.
Yes.
So in school after the revolution,
Mhm.
once they were kind of in elementary school and everything, there was like and I forget exactly what, but it was something akin to the Pledge of Allegiance, and it made the students declare that God did not exist. And so this
Really?
was, yeah, so this was quite
Was this like in
difficult.
public school that they had to recite this or
Yes, they
something?
had to
Like, oh
recite
my
it at the
God.
beginning, and I'm sure like
Wow.
those who are Cuban or Cuban
That's
American listening
intense.
would maybe have the the term for it.
Wow.
But there was these
Fascinating.
declarations being made, which, so if you think, that there are obviously the colonial history of Cuba had everyone declaring themselves Catholic, or Catholicism was imposed.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are, as you mentioned, other religious traditions being practiced, Santeria. Also, a lot of Jews as well. I wouldn't say like there's a
Mm-hmm.
predominance of Jews in Cuba, but many of them who were expelled in 1492, the Alhambra decree, many
Right.
of them ended up in Latin America, some in
Mm-hmm.
Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we have like there is religious diversity, is what I
Yeah,
mean to say, in Cuba.
for sure.
And so some of the tensions that occurred initially with the revolution were perhaps what I think contributed to that statistic being published, right? That people
Yeah.
are irreligious. But since, right, my travels in Cuba started probably in the 2000s,
Mm-hmm.
and as I've continued to study Cuba's religious history and its current religious story, I've been excited to know that more and more religious communities are finding space
Yes.
to practice. Like the I would say the government has created more space for folks to practice, and that includes
Mm-hmm.
Protestantism.
Good. Good.
And so as far as Santeria, it's funny, I actually just finished a unit on Santeria in my class
Oh, wow.
at the university. And I talked to the students about the fact that at some point in the 1800s, so
Mm-hmm.
19th century, there was, through the transatlantic slave trade, there was something around 70 to 80% of the population in Cuba was either enslaved African
Wow.
or their offspring, meaning
Wow.
that there was a lot of tracing to West African tribes like the
Mm-hmm.
Yoruba. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
therefore, for those who may not be familiar, Santeria is birthed out of that kind of oppressive condition of
Mm-hmm.
the transatlantic slave trade that brought enslaved Africans to Cuba, who were trying to preserve their spiritual traditions, but were not allowed to because of the colonial government's imposition of Catholicism,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore then created a religious practice, which some label as syncretic, others would have a different interpretation of what that is. But this then creates a way in which the enslaved Africans are able to continue to practice their African traditional religions under the guise, so to speak, of Catholicism. So I talked to my students how many in Cuba might even still attend, Catholic mass, etc., consider themselves Catholic, but are also practicing
Mm-hmm.
Santeria.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this kind of unique amalgamation of religious traditions in Cuba. I would also say that, among many of the Protestant communities I come out of, like evangelical, Quakers, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
there would not be such a warm reception to the
Right.
mixing of Santeria
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Christianity. But
Mm-hmm.
nevertheless, I always tell my students there's probably not there doesn't exist a Cuban who doesn't know what Santeria is. Like it's just also very much part of the cultural water.
There you go. Mm-hmm.
And so people, have references to it. There's different ways in which it shows up. Sometimes in explicit ways, sometimes implicit.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on what people's religious identity is. So I'm fascinated by it. We know one of
Yeah.
our colegas, Miguel de la Torre, wrote a book on
Mm-hmm.
Santeria as well,
Mm-hmm.
if people want to look that up and learn more about it. But yeah.
I love it. Yeah, no, it's been super interesting. Like the little bit that I've learned as far as like Caribbean religious history, things like that.
Hmm.
It is super interesting. Yeah, and it's true. Like the word syncretism has, it has
Right.
mixed reviews, but
Yeah.
but it's true. Like to be able to think of a community or a land where multiple things are happening at once, right? Like there's multiple belief systems, rituals, etc., and people may within themselves practice more than one thing. Right? It's
Right.
like you said, it's not uncommon to go to church and then go see the Santero afterwards or the next day. It's
Right.
not a conflict, right? It's not understood as a conflict within that person's like worldview.
Right.
And so I really appreciated you sharing that. And it's true, like this question of like religious freedom, right? What does it mean to push religious practices or faith traditions underground, or to make them kind of like perceived as like dangerous, right? There's a lot there
Yeah.
for sure.
You also, I'm sure you study in your work, like popular Catholicism, right?
Yes.
Which
Hmm.
is not necessarily the same as Santeria,
Right.
in the sense that there was no necessary, like that syncretic or the way people would define it syncretically.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, we know that in popular Catholicism, individuals are, professing to be Catholic and at the same
Hmm.
time practicing native and indigenous spiritual practices as well and incorporating those. And we also, I've talked to my students about how many times or at least post Vatican II, the Catholic Church has made some space for that a little bit more,
A
even
little
though
bit
there
more.
is some
Yeah.
tension. There's a
Hmm.
tension for sure as
Oh
far
yeah.
as the official teachings, and then what people are doing kind of in their homes.
In the streets.
And
Yeah.
so, right, in the streets. And so we have to understand as religious scholars who are studying
Hmm.
more like the phenomenon of what is religion and how it's being like how it's moving in the world.
It's
We can't
alive. Yeah.
ignore that that is
Hmm.
what people are
Hmm.
doing, you know?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like so right, so I think about like Guatemala and the rise of the evangelical churches, right? Those have
Yeah.
overtaken
Also.
much more than any Catholic church. Like people
Yeah.
are not interested really as much,
Yeah.
in attending Catholic church. Like these newer churches, Protestant denominations, people are resonating more, for many
Hmm.
different reasons. So it's fascinating to think about like the religion and politics of it all. And
Yes.
it's funny. So folks who know, I live in LA, and I was like driving around yesterday, like doing errands, and not too far from my home, I saw this botanica. I was like, Botanica Santa Muerte. I was like, oh,
Whoa.
like okay, like I was like, all right, like, so again, like this is what people are doing, like
Hmm.
whether, in other words, whether or not like the hierarchical church, whatever, deacons, pastors, pope, at that level, whether or
Hmm.
not it's accepted, whether or not people are like frowning upon it, the fact is it's happening, right?
Yeah.
The fact is it happens, it's happening. It's alive. Like people's faith tradition, religion, spirituality, it's a living, breathing thing. I think
Hmm.
that's kind of one of the things that I've
I
realized
agree.
more
Yep.
so, more than anything, over these last, several years of thinking about theology. I did
Right.
want to mention, backtracking for a second to when you were sharing about your parents and how they had to kind of like recite,
Yes. Yeah.
like a certain allegiance, right,
Hmm.
in school. I remember when I was living in Madrid, one of my professors, she lived through the Spanish Civil War. Okay.
Mm.
So she grew up during the dictatorship of
Wow.
Franco.
Right.
And she was telling us like these crazy stories of yeah, the things they had to recite. They had to learn like songs. They had to do all these things like allegiance to Franco, Catholic Spain, Spain, Spain. Really
Yeah.
fascinating stuff. Again, in terms of like politics, governments, religion, how religion is weaponized, alas, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
that connection is really fascinating. So,
Yeah, and it's interesting because it makes us think also then about like faith and politics in the US right
hmm.
now, right?
Hmm.
And like
Oh yeah.
what's what's fascinating to me is oftentimes folks, particularly, I'm going to speak from my community, Cuban American
Sure.
community, who many of them have those stories, have the experience in which a revolutionary government came in, and in almost seemingly overnight, they became like minoritized and persecuted for religious beliefs, and yet at the same time, we seem to have like some myopia or
Hmm.
just some. Uh, false awareness, I think, of the fact that this could very much happen again, even if
Hmm.
it's the religion that we ascribe to, right? So if we think in the United States, there may be a Christian minority, but are we comfortable with the fact that, if there is if Christianity is much more legislated within the
Right.
halls of government, how comfortable are we with other religious groups being minoritized in the same way? So it's all that kind of like oppressed becoming
Yeah.
oppressor kind of situation that I think we always have to just be mindful of. It's a very
Totally.
difficult conversation, but we have to be aware of the ways in which that kind of ideology has impacted us in the past, and
Sure.
try not to repeat it.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I always remind my students, I think one of the blessings and challenges, right,
Mm-hmm.
of the United States is that there's people from all over the world here.
Yep.
Quite literally, all different experiences, all different political
Yeah.
backgrounds in their home country, some escaping persecution in their home country for different reasons, religion, you name it. We have everything: Buddhist,
Yeah.
Jewish, atheist, agnostic, Wiccan, what you name it, we have it
Right.
right in the US. And so I feel like that in and of itself creates it's a challenge. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like where do you even begin to like, create a harmonious country? In
Right.
other words, I know people love to point to other countries and be like, look at the Netherlands, look at this, look at that, look how they're doing. It's like, yes, and most of those countries are very homogenous,
Right.
right? In phenotype, in political ideology, in religious ideology, whatever. So yeah, it's kind of easy when everyone's kind of on the same page to begin with.
Yeah.
I I really I feel like we have our work cut out for us if we can get it together. If
Right.
we
Right.
can get it right, it could be so beautiful, right? This is kind of the optimist in me. I think it could be so beautiful,
Could be.
right? If
Yeah.
we could find some way to navigate all these things, but you know, it's a lot, but
But you're right. It's like you can't compare apples to oranges, and you're right that
correct.
another in other parts of the world, the religious identity is much more not necessarily like not heterogeneous, but there is much more of a majority of one
Correct. Hmm.
particular type, and so yeah, so that's something that we always have to be thinking about and striving for. And it's so funny because I actually start the class talking about the fact that the United States has the holds the value of separation of church and state and religious pluralism, etc. But
Right.
as we've progressed as a society, it's just been interesting to see how
Mm.
some of perhaps maybe it's like the threats of the modern world that are making people a little bit more apprehensive about this
Mhm.
idea of religious pluralism or
Mhm. Mhm.
separation of church and state, which
Right.
I'm just curious about because I don't know, I don't share necessarily the same apprehension, but some people do. We can't deny it, right? So
Right. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, it's oh man, it's a lot. And we're if you're watching this in real time, we are not too far from our next election here in the
no, was it
US.
like
So
50 days or something?
something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Crazy.
Oh man, it's intense. It's intense.
Yes.
And so yeah, I mean I'm loving our conversation. I
Yeah,
wanted to
same.
kind of shift gears a tiny bit and think about a couple things. So thinking about DEI work, right, which has definitely been under attack, and then just life as a woman of color in academia,
Ooh, ooh,
of which we know all too well, right? We, as good friends, we've shared some of the ups and downs and
yes.
the challenges that we have faced
Yeah.
on this journey of academia, of becoming professors. So, so
Yes.
I'll let you decide which way we go,
Man.
or how you want to begin.
I guess I'll start by saying nowhere at all did little Grace think that she was going to end up in academia. Like not at all.
Right? Yeah.
I always tell people, if anything, while I was an undergrad, I was in love with your friend J Lo. You love J
I
Lo,
love it. I do love JLo. I do.
and
She's the best.
I think I was just impressed and inspired by the fact that she was this powerful Latina
Yeah.
who was,
You
very
know,
much seemingly in control of her businesses, of her,
yeah. Like,
impact.
yeah,
Mhm.
I have to say, I'm gonna do a little like cheerleading for my friend JLo. So, you know, this is the thing. People like to clown her a lot, right? Granted, her romantic life has been a struggle. We know it. It's been public. We know this. Okay, which is that's one thing. However, nothing can take away from her accomplishments.
Right.
I'm sorry. Like she started on In Living Color as a fly girl, dancing her heart out. Okay, she has perfumes. She had a clothing line at one point. She's
Right.
been countless movies. Singing, touring, Las Vegas residency. Now she has
Yes.
the Lola drinks,
Yeah.
like
Yes.
really, like you cannot fault the woman for her
Cannot.
empire. Like she had, right? Like she has really built something incredible. Um, yeah. So,
Yeah, she absolutely has. No, she absolutely has. I
yeah,
agree with you. And even back then, like again, I'm
yeah,
talking 20 years back,
yeah,
I
yeah.
was just, and I think what impressed me most about her, I wasn't going to be a fly girl. I knew I didn't have the kind of talent
Oh my gosh.
to make music or anything, but I think I was just impressed by the fact that she had all of these interests, right? And like,
Mhm.
and that this was around also the time in which the term like media mogul was like being thrown around, etc.
Right.
So there were several kind of people of color that were rising to this place of prominence,
Mhm.
and through multiple businesses. And at the time, I wasn't necessarily a business major. I actually ended up majoring in journalism, but I
Mhm.
was kind of this like person that had a multitude of interests and really struggled with like keeping my feet in one spot. So I was just drawn to the idea that like, oh, well, just like J-Lo, I could have a magazine. I could, have
Why
whatever I could
not?
do. So
You
all
still
that to
can, girl.
say, I still can't, but I'm tired. So like looking at retirement.
You're already ready for
So
retirement.
I know it's
I feel
weird.
you.
Yeah. So all that to say is that I was really much thinking that I was going to be in business and like an entrepreneur. I was kind of looking in that route, and then ended up
Mhm.
in corporate America because got student loans to pay, got
Yep.
got to make a job.
Yep.
And so, interestingly, around the time of corporate America, have this kind of like call, what we call kind of in the biz, so to speak, a call experience, and end up in seminary.
Mm.
Which is what, and even in seminary, I was thinking of becoming a pastor, right? Like I'm going to train to
Wow.
become a pastor. And that's another tangent we can take because
Ooh,
actually my,
we're gonna talk pastoring
yeah,
too. Hold
we can
on,
talk
yeah.
about that in a little bit. But all that to say is that that route didn't lead me in that direction. Instead, I decided to um, pursue what it might look like to do research like
Mhm.
I could also say that my seminary kind of had a pipeline toward PhDs. Like they really um encouraged folks to consider it. And
That's
I
good.
ended up considering it, interestingly, going back to the beginning of our conversation. So, in my seminary experience, where I'm like excited, I am gun ho to learn about God and to learn about God's activity in the world and everything. And yet, all I'm learning about are European communities and their migrant communities here. And I'm like, wait a minute, like the community I come from
Mhm.
is not connected to this history, at least not directly, right? Like, sure,
Yeah.
it's been impacted by it. But all that to say is that I was finding myself having to do extra work on the side to try to
Mhm.
find out who are the, inspirational theologians in the Latinx community and
Love it.
who have been the pioneers, the leaders in our community. And I knew that they existed, and I was
Mhm.
shocked that I wasn't learning about them. And then there was also at that time the discussion of the nuns, the religious nuns, NONES.
Right.
The folks that are spiritual but not religious, and the
Right.
rise of this, and all of the debate around like what does that mean for the religious landscape of the U.S.
Mhm.
And I remember around that time, and I talked to my students about this. The Time magazine issued a article written by their religion reporter Elizabeth Diaz, who titled her report "The Latino Reformation" and was talking about the fact that Latino Protestants in the United States were actually on the rise. And so
Oh.
I was like, okay, well, finally, because I feel like I made that same argument
Right, 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 right.
in one of
Look,
my
I said that
classes, and my
already.
professor was like, I mean, not to say that, I could have written the article, but all that to say is that this was something that was clear to me because I was
Right.
part of the community. I was an insider to that community, but I
Exactly.
recognized that folks outside of the community were not realizing that this phenomenon was happening. So
Mhm.
I decided, well, what it would look like, and here I have to shout out FTE, then called the Forum for Theological Exploration.
Right.
Um, through whom I got a fellowship that allowed me to go to Cuba and actually start researching like my family's religious history. And through
Love it.
that, I end up writing like a master's thesis and end up deciding, yeah, I think I want to do this, like be a historian of like Protestantism in Latin America and like
Mhm.
look at these stories that haven't been told and too few have been written. And so that lead me, what I didn't expect was the academy part of that,
Uh-huh.
because I love, and I think a lot of researchers will say, they love their work, they love the things that they research, they love the writing, etc. Being in the system of the academy is another part of the beast that's,
Hmm.
many of us kind of struggle with, because just like most of the broken systems in our country, and in our world, the academy needs a lot of reform. And we are very much still in that phase of needing to figure out, how do we make this system equitable? How do
Hmm.
we create education that's accessible to folks? How do we, um, yeah, yeah. So anyway, I don't know if there is a particular vein in that topic about the academy, but
Oh my gosh.
that's kind of
All
where
of
I'm
it. All of the above, right?
yeah,
I choose all
a
of the above.
lot.
Yeah, it's so real and it's so much, right? Like there's so much going on. So, speaking of like the nuns, the
Yeah.
people who identify as spiritual, not religious, there's a good book. It's been out for a while, but I think it's still very helpful and relevant. It's by Elizabeth Drescher. It's called
Oh,
Choosing Our Religion.
okay.
And I believe she's still on faculty at Santa Clara University. And, especially when I was teaching at Loyola Marymount, which is my alma mater also, it was so perfect because the community was very similar, right? Santa
Hmm.
Clara community, California base, et cetera. But it was fascinating to think about, people's trajectory, and the way people kind of like leave churches, they return to church sometimes when they have children. It was fascinating. It was really, really interesting. So
Yes,
that's on the nuns. I thought that was a great book. And
it
then
was.
I feel you as far as, wanting to hear from people in my own community in terms of like religion and theology, etc. Because I remember the same thing, especially in doctoral program. It's like, okay, general comprehensive exams, you have to know the basics. The basics meaning the Europeans, right?
Yeah, the classics.
Schleiermacher, your
Hmm.
Augustine, your Aquinas, your Luther, all you got to know those guys, right? Guys,
Yeah, right.
that's
Literally, guys.
right. Literally, the dudes. You need to know the dudes. These are like the forefathers of theology. I was in systematics, and I was like, okay. But
Right.
it is one of those things. It's like you have to, in academia, you really do have to kind of like prove yourself. And we talked about this, like for example, at HTI all the time. It's like, okay, we have to know that stuff plus plus, right? Like my specialization. So, things from Central American scholars, Catholic scholars, right, etc.
Right.
Um, things from like Elizabeth Conde Fraser or Maria Pilar Aquino, Carmen Nanco Fernandez, right? Orlando Speen, like all of these people who have been mentors and things that have built, US Latinx theology. But truly, it was this sense of like, okay, they're not considered part of the canon, quote unquote, when you go to these seminaries and stuff. And it was very jarring at first and frustrating. And I'm so grateful that at least like I had other friends at other institutions like Grace who were going through something very similar.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's I feel like that's been one of the hardest things about being in the academy, finding that um you know scholars of color, Latino, non-Latino, we're all bringing in, those of us particularly, not all of us focus, let's say, let me just also clarify that, not all of us focus on like scholarship that one would determine as Latino, meaning we're
Mhm.
not all centered on Latinx communities here in the U.S., or we're not focused on Latin America.
Right.
Nevertheless, I would
Mhm.
say that those of us who are contributing to the North American Academy, because
Correct.
the knowledge already exists out in the world, but to the
Right.
North American Academy, we're making accessible a
Mhm.
body of work that otherwise, no one is troubling themselves in to
Right.
pursue, right? And so, but we're not getting bonus points for that, and the most part, I would say, and that's hard. And yeah, I think that that's one of the things that I would like to see change in the
Mhm.
academy, a little bit more recognition of the knowledge that is being added on, because ultimately that's what our business is, right? Like
Right.
helping in the construction of knowledge and the
Mhm.
dissemination of knowledge. And so,
Mhm.
but oftentimes what has been deemed knowledge has been a very narrow understanding, limited to a
Correct.
geographic area of the world,
Mhm.
etc. And so that becomes kind of, I think, a big point for me, that I want to know that my work is going to matter and is going to be seen as valuable.
Yes.
And sometimes that's like not very clearly expressed. And so
Correct. Yeah.
that becomes kind of one of those hard things, because we're all putting in a lot of work,
Yeah.
and then when you
Absolutely.
add on also the fact that, for example, a lot of for those of us who again are teaching Latinx studies or
Mhm.
Latin American studies, when we still find that in institutions of higher education we're still having a struggle for people from the Latinx community to get to college, right?
Mhm.
The struggle is still very much there. There are financial barriers, educational barriers, etc.
Totally.
um, it makes it also difficult to
Mhm.
to think that there's change happening, right? And at the same time, like I'm like you, I'm an optimist. I want to say that change is happening, as slow as it may feel. But yeah, when you kind of get up every day and you want to see that there are more folks like you
Mhm.
getting into the halls of academia and contributing their knowledge and experience, and that's still being something that's difficult to attain, that can be disheartening as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, we have so many friends and colleagues that are brilliant, right? Like they are
Yeah. Uh-huh.
brilliant. They're incredible people. And even still, right? Because of the way academia is set up, their work doesn't fit the box, right?
Right.
Their work is seen as like, well, it's not rigorous enough. It's not this, it's not that. However they want to like label it. And it's very frustrating because it's like, okay, if we don't open our minds a little bit,
Yes.
right? This thing is going to stay the same, right? Academia is going to stay the same. All these institutions are never going to change. Um and it's frustrating for sure. Like yeah, it's yeah, it's really wild when I think about that journey. Now I have to say the experience of teaching in a theology department has been very different versus teaching in ethnic studies, right? So
Mm,
for
yes.
folks who don't know, I've taught in like a theology department at a Catholic university, and now I'm teaching in a Chicanx and Central American studies specifically at a huge public institution, and so that's been different, right? As far
Right.
as like the students in my classroom, the materials that we're reading, like the way I approach it, right? So even that, even that is unique. And so yeah,
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
feel you, friend. It's like
Even
really
also, so I hear you talking about like the difference between like teaching in different disciplines, but
yeah,
also the institution matters too. Because
absolutely,
having
yeah,
gone myself to my undergraduate experience being at a state institution, and now
sure.
teaching at a private institution, I noticed like
It's
the
different,
difference
yeah.
in the classroom,
The
the
students,
students
like,
who are coming, the experience that they may have,
mhm,
and so and also even the interests, right, from what they're interested in doing beyond.
correct.
And so it makes it a little bit challenging, especially at a time in which, so you were mentioned DEI,
Mm-hmm.
and there are the challenges to DEI. There is a benefit to being in institution like where I am, where it's private, because that those kinds of challenges from the government, for example, don't necessarily impact the institution. It really,
Right.
the institution has a little more autonomy in that regard.
Yeah.
But I will say that still there are conversations where folks are, questioning things like affirmative action, or questioning whether or not people of color should have any particular, whether or not the system should take into account, I think, generally
Mm-hmm.
people of color. Like, I think that's
Mm-hmm.
really at base what we're trying to do
Yeah.
with some of the DEI initiatives. Um, and it's sad because the counter argument tends to be, well, don't you want to be recognized on your
On your merit and
education, your merit,
right. Right.
etc. And I would say, yeah, I would love
Of
to do
course.
that, but it's not going to happen until we recognize even who's in the room,
Disparities.
right, the
Yeah.
disparities. So, yeah, that's
Exactly.
we
No,
become,
it
and then to not acknowledge this, we then become even more invisibilized. Like, okay, we're
correct. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. Um, yeah, so friend, as we wrap up, so this is a question that I kind of like to close out with is what advice would you give little you? So little Grace, what advice would you give? And I add this kind of at the end of each episode because I feel like, especially for Latinas, for young women, this world can be very harsh, right? And I think it really can play on all our insecurities, especially with social media, feeling not enough, feeling, not pretty enough, not this, not that. And so I really am asking the women that I'm interviewing to share their wisdom because I think that all of you are such amazing human beings and have really, you know, I know for a fact because I know each of you personally have overcome so many things and I think that that wisdom is so beautiful to try to share with others.
yeah. Well, thank you for that. Wow. I feel like now, looking back, I would definitely tell my younger self, mess up, like make mistakes. I was kind of the middle child in my
Mm.
family, or I am the middle child in my family, and like textbook middle child. And so um add to that the fact that I was an immigrant child,
Mm.
meaning that, immigrants in this country tend to kind of have this hyper desire to excel, to
Yes.
kind of show, right, that the migration sacrifices were worth it, kind
Worth
of
it.
thing. And
Hmm.
that gets passed down in generation. Like, we didn't leave our country to now come here and now, to do what we
Right.
said we were. So, like,
Right.
all of that weight, right,
That
when you're
pressure.
thinking
Yeah.
as a child, all of that pressure, especially now, thinking myself, I'm a mother now, and so I think of my son, and I just think, like,
Yeah.
I hope I don't pass that all down. Not because there was no good in it, but all to say is that it led to this feeling where, like, I can't mess up. Like, I need
Right.
to represent, like,
Well.
myself, my
Hmm.
family, my
Hmm. Hmm.
like my whole race, and that's the whole thing. But all that to say is, I think that now that's I struggle with perfectionism, right? I would want to tell myself, and I'm starting to kind of gain these nuggets of wisdom, right? We're always learning, we're always evolving and becoming.
Yes.
And so I would, I can see in my younger self just really struggling to to be like mature, to be like perfect, and to like always never mess up. And
Right.
I think that now I want people, even my classrooms, I want the students to mess up, like say the wrong thing, like
It's okay.
that's how we
Hmm.
learn.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's probably what I would say to myself at this point. Ask me
I
advice,
love
Dr.
it.
G.
It's
I'll answer for
okay
advice,
to make
right?
mistakes. Yeah, it's okay to make mistakes. I feel you. So I'm the eldest child. There's two of us. I have a younger brother. And it's true. Like I struggle with I've shared this with you. I've struggled with perfectionism for a long time. And it's funny, I don't know if this is like a Latino thing or maybe other, communities do this too. The sense of like you are a representative of your family,
Yeah.
right? Like, do right, excel, do awesome things because your achievements are also our achievements, right?
Right.
Which, it's beautiful to a degree, but also that's a lot of pressure. You
Hmm.
know, it's a lot of pressure. And it's funny too. I mean, this is kind of a thing, I think, especially in immigrant families. It's like the options are doctor, lawyer, teacher. You need to do something amazing, right? And so, yeah, it's a lot. It can be a lot of pressure. And I meant to mention this earlier when you were talking about being, I think it was in grad school, or you're thinking about becoming a pastor.
Oh, yes.
Actually, one of the interviews that I did with my friend Brenda Vaca, she was a pastor for the United Methodist Church for a long time, and so in that episode, she shares her journey. Her journey. Um, yeah, it's really fascinating. She went from pastor to real estate to now she's a owner of a publishing house. So, you know,
Wow.
it's yeah,
Okay.
it's so the journey. Again, it's kind of like this theme of nonlinear faith, right? Like the journey is fascinating and wild for each of
Yes.
us.
Yes, it is. And it's funny with that particular episode in my life, and it's still an ongoing episode, if I can call it that.
Right, right.
That that a lot of it also has to do with the issues of patriarchy in the church, and so
Yep.
that I think is a big thing that we have to think about and deal with as well. And so, yeah, so I think
Totally.
for me, it's been an issue of like in my denomination, they don't ordain women. And so that has been difficult to
Right.
navigate. And at the same time, feeling called to ministry. And so it's part of the reason why I also am interested in kind of women's issues and thinking
Sure.
about like how do we create a church again where everyone's included,
Mm-hmm.
and where God, people can pursue their spirituality in the ways God has directed them to, regardless of
Mm-hmm.
what the outside system has dictated or limited in
Mm-hmm.
whatever man-made way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 1,000%. My denomination either, right? I'm Roman Catholic.
Hmm.
They're not.
They're not, no,
I don't
they
think
do
there's going to be any women priests anytime soon. I mean, there is like a tiny handful of like, they're sort of like this rebellious
yes.
group of women that were
There's
ordained, but
always a little remnant,
there's
yes.
always a little rebel. Yeah, I love the rebels. I love the rebels. Um, but in terms of like mainstream, Roman Catholicism, it's not happening. So I feel you. Yeah, like I think to myself, I'm like, I know I'd be a great pastor. You'd be a great pastor. Like, what's going on? But
Yes, yes.
anyway,
Right.
yeah,
Historia para otro día.
for another day, exactly, for another episode. Oh my gosh. Dr. Grace Vargas, this was amazing. I love it. Thank you for everything that you share with us. You're super, super awesome. I'll make sure to tag you when I upload this episode. Folks, thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us today on the Gold Hoops and God podcast. Again, I'm your host, Dr. Guerra. Remember, our episodes are available on YouTube with video and sound. And then if you want to do audio, you can listen to season 1 and season 2 wherever you stream your podcast. So Spotify, Apple Music, all the rest. Make sure you follow us on goldhoops_God on Instagram. And then I will link our YouTube link as well. Have a good one. Bye, everyone. Bye. Thank you, mujeres, for joining me today on the Gold Hoops and God podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Guerra. Make sure you join us every Wednesday. You can listen to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and many more. Don't forget, we also have a YouTube channel where you can watch season 1 of the podcast. And we're on Instagram at goldhoops_God. Interact with me, send me a message, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.